Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. And welcome to this ATX webinar, Advancing Beyond TX to support the March 2025 exams. My name is Hazel McLucas and I am an Education Partner Support Manager here at ACCA. And as the title of the webinar suggests, Advancing Beyond TX, our session today is designed to support you with your upcoming exams. Our expert tutor, Aileen Edgar, has joined us to share practical guidance on how to step up from the taxation exam. Aileen will provide insights into the nature of tasks, their structure, and their correct usage of tools while answering the ATX questions. She'll also showcase a few examples to help you write the answers that will help you earn the marks needed to pass the exam. And finally, she'll answer the questions that you've submitted in the Q&A live towards the end of the session. But before I hand over to Aileen, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items just very quickly. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a number of icons that you can use. There's a help icon, which provides resources and information to help you resolve any technical issues that you might experience during the webinar. There's also an icon for both the slides and the media player, and you'll need both of these during the webinar, so please make sure you've selected them and you can see them on your screen. There's an attendee chat, so you can engage with fellow webinar attendees. However, please do not share your personal information in the chat. There's also a resource list, which is a file icon, and if you click on this, you'll be able to access useful resources relevant to today's webinar, and this will also include any direct links. You can rearrange your screen to suit and resize the windows if you need to, and if at any point you can't hear what's been said or see any of the visuals, the best thing to do is refresh your browser. Registering for today's webinar means that you'll be sent an email tomorrow with the details on how to listen to it again. So don't worry if you miss something that's said or if you have any technical issues, you'll be able to access the recording. I'm going to hand over to Aileen in a moment and we'll be back with you at the end of the session. If you'd like to ask ACCA or Aileen any questions, then please post them in the Q&A section on your screen. Please note we can't guarantee responding to everyone directly, either verbally or in the web chat, but we hope that the questions that are shared today will be helpful to everyone in the session. And now I'll pass over to Aileen.
Thank you very much indeed, Hazel. Hello, everybody. I just want to add my welcome on to Hazel's then. Thank you for joining us live today as we go through how to step up from the TX exam or your previous studies of tax at university to the ATX exam. My name is Aileen Edgar. I've been a tax tutor since 2008, supporting thousands of students through their studies over the years. And today I'm going to be using that knowledge and experience to help you prepare for your ATX exam. So the purpose of the session then, as Hazel outlined, is to go through how the ATX exam is different to TX or to university exams, but also how you can use some of those foundational skills and knowledge to help you prepare for the ATX exam too. We'll have some time at the end for questions, so and don't feel you need to wait until then to put in your question. Please do start putting your questions into the Q&A box from now, and then I'll aim to get through as many as I possibly can at the end of the session. So, before we get started, I wanted to kick off with a little poll to see how many of you who are live on the call just now were actually exempt from the TX exam and so haven't experienced the ACCA way of examining tax. So there should be a little poll appearing on your screen. If you're able to, just pop a yes or a no as to whether you were exempt from the TX exam. It just gives me a little idea of how we're doing with the sort of spread of people live on the call today. So you just pop yes or no. Okay, so most of you have had experience of going through the TX exam then, so that's good, as it'll certainly have got you prepared for the ACCA style of exams. But either way, you are going to see some big differences in how ATX is examined compared to your previous tax studies. There's going to be more narrative elements where you're asked to give advice, more application of your knowledge. There's going to be very little to be gained from brain dumps of knowledge. There's going to be mixing up of taxes, mixing together, which wouldn't have happened at TX. And we're going to see in this session today how these things happen, because I'm going to show you some examples of ATX questions so you can see how these differences look, and we can discuss how best to approach them and prepare for these in the run-up to your exam. So let's talk about the exam format and content. The aim of the ATX exam is for you to show that you can provide clients, and that's both individuals and businesses, with the information and advice that they need regarding the impact of the main UK taxes on their financial decisions and different situations that they find themselves in. The emphasis at this level of exam is on the practical application of tax rules to given client scenarios and the giving of clear and helpful advice. Calculations that you're going to be doing are often going to be required in support of explanations and advice. It's going to be up to you to decide which calculations to produce in order to do this in the most efficient manner possible. Now, let me know in the chat box if you think that at ATX there's going to be more narrative or more computations than what you saw either at TX, if you sat that, or from your previous university studies when you were sitting tax. What do you think? More narrative or more computational? Let me know in the chat box, and we'll get a wee idea of what your expectations are. Okay, so you might have already heard this already or no, but at TX or at university, you were more likely to have been tested predominantly on computational aspects of tax. But now we're at ATX, the balance shifts in the opposite direction, which I see lots of you are saying that, yes. We actually see more narrative on the whole than we do computation, but that's not the only thing that is different. So got this summary table here, really contrasting the different aspects within the TX paper and the ATX paper. So question styles, objective test questions, you had those in TX. So multiple choice questions, fill in the blank, just entering in a number. And you also had some longer form questions, whereas now at ATX, it's all long form style questions. There's no multiple choice questions anymore. Some of you might be very happy about that, some less so. What about the skills that you're being expected to demonstrate? At the lower level of tax exams, it's much more focused on your knowledge, your understanding, your ability to perform calculations, whereas now we're stepping up to ATX, it's much more about professional skills of communication, analysis and evaluation, your commercial acumen, your professional skepticism, and also more about giving advice to clients. The exam format itself is also different. At TX, we had objective test questions for 2 of the sections, and then the 3rd section, you were either given word processing answer space or a spreadsheet answer space. And mostly it was spreadsheets that you were using in that section C. Whereas now at ATX, the ball is in your court. You have to choose whether to answer in the word processor or the spreadsheet, or indeed both. And actually, I see that more people will tend to use the word processing answer space for the bulk of their answers in ATX, and then dip into the spreadsheet for their supporting calculations as needed. The exam's longer, 15 minutes longer. The purpose or the hope is that you spend some time reading, planning, thinking before you're answering, much more so than you maybe have done at previous tax studies. The number of marks overall is the same, but at ATX, we don't have 100 technical marks, we have 80 technical marks. And then there's 20 professional skills marks that you'll be allocated by your marker as well. But you're going to be focusing on the technical marks, the 80 technical marks in that 3 hours and 15 minutes that you've got for the exam. So timings wise, how should you manage your time in the exam? Super important. when you were looking at TX, the rule of thumb was 1.8 minutes per mark. Now we've got 80 technical marks and not 100 that we're trying to get, and we're doing it in 3 hours, 15 minutes. We are looking at 2.4 minutes per technical mark, or you could use 2.25 if you want to have some separate reading time. Okay, so lots of differences there between the way that the exams are actually structured and how you're going to manage your time in them. Let's consider now what's going to be familiar to you from your previous tax studies. So the taxes here on the screen are still examinable. The weighting of the marks in the exam is similar in that income tax and corporation tax are the two biggest areas. Inheritance tax, VAT are smaller. You've also still got admin rules like deadlines for payments of taxes, penalties, and interest to concern yourself with. There is still going to be a mixture of calculation and narrative, but as we've seen, the balance of that has shifted now in ATX to less calculation overall, although there are still lots of numbers in there, please don't worry. At TX, there would have been an expectation that you minimise clients' tax bills where possible, and that is still the same at ATX, but whereas before, you would have often been told how to do it. So a requirement might have said, calculate the client's capital gains tax liability, assuming that business asset disposal relief applies. But now at ATX, you're more likely to be asked something like, calculate the client's capital gains tax liability, assuming they make use of any beneficial reliefs or exemptions. So you need to figure out what reliefs might apply to help get that client's tax bill a little bit lower. So you'll be expected to identify tax planning measures in order to minimise and/or defer the tax liabilities to some point in the future. And sometimes advice can be as simple as changing the timing that a transaction happens. Now, at ATX, the exam questions usually involve giving some tax advice and recommendations on a particular course of action to ensure, for example, the optimum use of reliefs. You have to consider consequences, advantages and disadvantages of taking different courses of action way more than you had to do when you were doing TX. Some areas of the syllabus are the same, but the verbs have changed to be more focused on application and advice, and how to apply knowledge of tax implications into given scenarios. Questions might require you to address the UK tax implications of a given situation without actually telling you which particular taxes to consider. It's going to be up to you to identify the relevant taxes and issues in respect of those taxes before you begin to put your answers together. So the style of questions, very different. No MCQs, less pure calculation elements, more background detail about your client, and so on. You'll be given information in exhibits, which are, if you're not familiar with it from previous other professional level exams, they're little pop-up boxes. Some of them are not that little, just to warn you, particularly in question 1, there can be a lot of information in there as well to get used to. You're going to have more steers in the scenario to watch out for, and you're going to be given more complex scenarios to consider, maybe being given some incomplete information and having to make some assumptions. There's extra topics on all the taxes from your previous studies, so extra tax reliefs to learn about, the treatment of particular transactions, more emphasis on overseas aspects of each tax as well. And many areas require you to have a much more in-depth understanding. So trusts, for example, you're expected to understand more about those. Now, as we saw, professional marks didn't exist for the TX exam, but at ATX, we're looking for relevant application of rules to scenarios in a sensible way. And the professional marks come under 4 categories. We've got communication, analysis and evaluation, commercial acumen, and skepticism. And at ATX, ethics has got a much more prominent place within the syllabus. There will be a dedicated 5 marks of ethics in question 1 in your ATX exam, and it'll be a separate requirement. It should be easy for you to spot. Each question that you're going to be dealing with is bigger. So the 50 mark question, 25 mark questions, but they're broken down into a larger amount of requirements for you to work on. And these requirements can have multiple actions in them. So you need to spend a bit more time reading and planning to make sure you haven't missed anything. As I said already, you're going to have to make the choice about whether the word processor, spreadsheet, or indeed both of them is the best place to put your answer. Whereas in TX, you were given the format that the examiner thought was the most appropriate for that requirement. In terms of the number of marks per requirement, 3 marks tends to be the smallest requirement that we see on the marking guide, whereas at TX, you could have had 1 or 2 marks for a small requirement in section C. And the way that you're going to answer things is also different in that you'll have more focus on planning, I hope so anyway, structure, linking issues, consider different angles as well. Admin rules probably getting examined in less depth, for example, but you're less likely to get away with brain dumps or purely knowledge now. What new things will you need to deal with in terms of actual topics at ATX? You will learn about a set of taxes called stamp taxes that you won't have covered previously at TX. You'll also look at trusts, which you may well have come across before, especially in inheritance tax when looking at a lifetime gift made to a discretionary trust, which is a CLT, a chargeable lifetime transfer. But now you're going to be looking at the tax implications of these from an income tax, inheritance tax, and capital gains tax point of view. You'll get tested on overseas issues across the different taxes, much more than was at the case at TX. And this is a hugely important area for you to focus on while preparing for your ATX exam. You're going to have to think about tax planning more. So think about disapplying certain reliefs or not applying the maximum amount because maybe it's more tax beneficial for your client. You're also going to have to spot reliefs that might apply rather than being told to apply them. You also learn about a number of anti-avoidance rules that are designed to stop people manipulating the tax legislation to keep money out of the taxman's hands, like using an intermediary company to invoice a client rather than being treated as an employee of that client. Certain aspects examined, perhaps not that often at TX, become more frequently examined at ATX. So for an example, capital gains tax on takeovers. Ethics has got a much bigger status in the ATX exam, as already discussed, and we'll see more on that later on. There are a small number of things that are not examinable at ATX that were at TX, including, for example, the higher earner child benefit tax charge, contents of a VAT invoice, basic tax point for VAT, but the vast majority of what you learnt before is still relevant now and is also examinable. Now, these things that are called assumed knowledge from your previous tax studies, these are what the examiner considers to be easy marks. So you want to make sure that you are picking those ones up. We're going to look at an example later on so you can see just how important your prior knowledge is now. Now, unlike at TX, where you will pretty much be able to see all the information you need on the screen at the same time, maybe just a little bit of scrolling here and there, at ATX, you are going to have to learn how to manage your screen. So if you haven't done other professional papers, this is definitely something you need to spend some time working on. The 50-mark question in section A is particularly detailed. There's multiple exhibits. There's also 2 places where you'll find the requirements. There's a requirement exhibit, but all that really tells you to do is do the work that your manager has asked you to do. You need to actually go to the exhibit that's called work to be carried out, and you'll see a breakdown in there of the mark allocation and much more detail on what you're actually being asked to do. So as you do each requirement, I would recommend you copy and paste the detailed requirements into your answer space. Use it to start formulating a plan for your answer. You need to practice managing all these exhibits and seeing that you can resize them, you can highlight things in them, you can open and close them multiple times, etc. So make sure you are using the practice platform and attempting questions in there. You do not want to be stressing on exam day because you're not familiar with the layout and capabilities of the exam software. Now, section B, there's 2 25-mark questions, and they'll have the requirements detailed in the requirements exhibit. There's likely just to be one other exhibit to open that's got the background detail that you need, so you've got less to manage on the screen. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read all of this that's on the screen just now. Please don't panic. I just wanted to show you what a typical format for requirements can look like at ATX compared with TX. Because there you go. This is a TX example here. So you can see there's much less detail. There's fewer requirements. And also underneath each of those requirements in the TX exam, you would have been given either a word processing or spreadsheet answer space. Whereas at ATX, you're going to have to open up the word processing answer space, open up the spreadsheet, and put the relevant parts of your answer, maybe working across both of those types while you're answering a requirement. Another thing I mentioned as being quite a big step up then in ATX was the ethical component in the exam. So I've got an example of an ethics requirement here on the screen for you from section A. There was some background information in an exhibit giving details on a proposed strategy that this client's business advisor had suggested to them. And you're given 2 bullet points, but can you see, actually, you've got 3 things to do. You've got 3 tasks to do for 5 marks. You can see where I've highlighted particular words, and that's how I know there's 3 things for you to do. You've got to cover the difference between tax evasion and avoidance. You have to state the reason for the general anti-abuse rules. And then we get to the bit where you look at the client's own specific situation and explain why GAR would actually apply. Okay, so here you can see then we're trying and relate our ethics the best we can to the ACCA Code of Ethics. That's something we want to do. So I'm just going to get you to pop in the chat box. Do you know what the 5 ethical competencies are? And what one do you think is the most relevant to this particular question? So there's 5 professional competencies, 5 ethical competencies in the ACCA Code of Ethics. What one of them do you think is most relevant to this ethics question? So while you're doing that, usually the ethics requirement, you'll have multiple things to do. In this particular question, one of these is very specifically related to the client's own particular situation. The examiner in this question has tried to steer you in the right direction. They ask you to explain why it would apply to the business advisor strategy that you've been given information about in the exhibit in the question. So they will try and push you towards giving a complete answer that's going to score the maximum number of marks. Okay, so usually, let's do the 5 competencies first of all. What are they? They're professional behaviour for ethical competencies, professional behaviour, professional competence and due care, integrity, confidentiality and objectivity. So which one is most relevant here? Now, usually it is a bit more obvious in this example. I have chosen a little bit of a nasty one. But quite often we'll have things like conflict of interest between clients of our firm, or maybe we're concerned about confidentiality obligations, and they'll use that word in the actual scenario or requirement. And so that's a nice signpost to you as to which one applies. Here in this particular example, it's to do with professional competence and due care, which, just looking at the chat there, yep, loads of you getting that one, and also noting what the other competencies are as well. Lots of you thinking it might be integrity here, perhaps. And yes, I can see where you're coming from with that one. In this particular marking scheme, the marks were given for professional competence and due care as the most relevant, because we as advisors need to steer our client away from potential tax evasion and apply our knowledge of standards and law correctly. Integrity is much more about acting with honesty, which isn't the most appropriate one for this particular scenario, because there's nothing to suggest that we as advisors are in any risk of not acting honestly here. But I think with ethics, quite often there will be maybe a couple that you're thinking of, and I would definitely put them both down and I would justify why I think they apply to the situation. And quite often we'll see in marking schemes as well, maybe there's like one that's the kind of main one, and then it'll say as a little kind of marking note that credit would also be given if the student also mentioned this other one. So it's really important that you practice some ethics requirements from Section A questions before your exam. Really, really important. You want to come out of that exam feeling super confident anyway, but certainly confident that you got those 5 ethics marks, and they tend to be fairly quick ones to pick up compared to other requirements. Okay. So a few other things just to think about in terms of what you've learned before at TX and how that's going to be a little bit different now. ATX brings in multiple different business and personal tax topics together in a scenario, and it tests a much more in-depth understanding of how the different taxes work and how they apply in that situation. You're much less likely to get big pro forma computations. So big trading adjustments, capital allowances computations, less likely to see them. It's not to say it can't happen, but it's far less likely than what you had at TX. So with capital allowances, for example, it might actually be quicker for you just to do a little working on the actual line in your computation where you're saying how much capital allowances can be deducted, than going away off into a working, setting it all up with some headings, and then realizing there's only actually one calculation to do, and you could have just done that as part of the rest of your trading computation. Loss relief questions, there's much more emphasis on discussing the most tax efficient use of the losses. You won't always be given a steer as to which way. At TX, quite often you were told that the client wanted to use the losses as early as possible. Less likely to see that kind of steer, although there will still be little hints and things in there as well. You have to look for them, but you have to do more work to find those steers. Greater emphasis on tax planning as well, so giving the client some advice on proposed strategies. Also, in terms of what we call the taxonomy between ATX and TX, we will also see the verbs that are being used changing too. In the TX syllabus, and indeed in the exam itself, you're more likely to see verbs like identify, state, describe, determine, calculate, explain. At ATX, we're more likely to see advise, recommend, compare, explain with supporting calculations, and so on. This is a higher level paper, and you are expected to be demonstrating a higher level of skill. Okay, so you can see here, in this example I've put here, I've highlighted a little comparison here between TX and ATX. So we've got ATX verbs underlined there, and we've got TX ones. Now you can see that actually in both those we've got the word explain, but there is a subtle difference, a very subtle difference there, but it's so important. This is a big part of this jump up to ATX. Do you see how after the word explain in the ATX examples, it says explain which of the options, explain how relief will be given. Whereas at TX, it just say explain the options. The explain at TX is much closer to state, identify. The explain we have at ATX is much closer to advise. We're still using the same verb, but the context of it is different, and what you're expected to do is different. It's at a higher level now. You're going to be expected to explain when certain reliefs or rules apply and why, rather than just being able to use the figures. So that's another difference we can see from the wording of the requirements in this example, but also many other examples that you'll be looking at. Also, another thing just to point out with this example, less to do with verbs. But at TX, you're much more likely to be told to go and do a large pro forma computation. At ATX, less so, as I said. At ATX, you're much more likely to be focusing on tax saving. So do you see that in the second part of B part 1 or 2? B part 2 is there for ATX. The second thing to do is to calculate the amount of tax saving. You're not being asked to just go and do the computation. You're being asked to focus on tax saving. And this is very, very common to see at ATX. It's a step up in the skill and application of your understanding of tax computations. You can't just rely on memorizing big pro forma anymore. You need to be able to think about how you can take shortcuts. How can you jump into the middle of a situation to give your client the answers that they are looking for? So a little summary then. What's different ATX? Scenarios, much more detailed. Tasks, more complicated. Less obvious sometimes. If any of you have done this exam before, that's a common thing I hear from resetters is like, how do I know what it is I'm being asked to do? So maybe you can relate to that. The answers, you're going to be working across both response areas. There's more marks for application and explaining why things are the way they are. And also we've got those professional skills marks as well. So as I mentioned, one of the big changes is you're not going to be doing these big computations from pro forma as much anymore. And instead, you are expected to be able to take shortcuts. And one of the things the examiner loves to refer to is working at the margin. Give me a thumbs up if you have heard this phrase. You might have read it in an examiner's report. You might have heard it from your tutors. You might have seen it online. Maybe when you've had some marking done and got some feedback from somebody, they've talked about that. You've looked at a solution in an exam kit. Working at the margin, really, really important. If you haven't heard about this, then this is a really, really important point we're going to look at. And I'm going to give you an example of this. It can be really challenging at first. So I wanted to use an example from the exams to show you what it means and how to approach it. Okay, so this is a little quote from the ATX examining team about this working at the margin thing. So they're advising that you need to think about how to work more efficiently. Avoid churning out big pro forma computations when actually you could have got to the same answer much, much faster. You're much less likely now to be asked to do a full income tax computation, a full corporation tax computation, although that does still come up sometimes. The examiner expects you to work at the margin, and the time, crucially, the time that they set for a requirement will assume that you are working at the margin where it is relevant. So in this requirement here from an ATX exam, how would we know that the examiner was expecting us to use a marginal approach and not to recreate big computations? What does a marginal approach even mean? It means thinking about what has changed. What is the impact of a particular course of action on this person's tax situation? What would be different? Would they now pay more tax at 40% tax? Therefore, all I need to do is work out the amount that they're going to have more income and multiply it by 40%, and I've worked out how much extra tax there's due. It can be as simple as that, rather than doing one computation and then a repeat computation with some of the numbers changed and then comparing the two taxes at the bottom. Marginal approaches would be looking at, well, what's changed and what would be the tax impact of that change? And I'll just do those calculations and I'll save myself a bunch of time. But how are you going to know that that's actually what they want you to do? Because sometimes actually they do want you to do full computations because actually that's the most appropriate thing to do. Bit confusing, isn't it? So there are clues. There are clues all over the ATX paper. You need to get good at spotting them. They're always there in front of you, but students tend to focus on the what. What have I got to do? They miss out on looking for the how. How have I to do it? Okay, so let's look at this example here. What clues have we got that the examiner expects us to take a marginal approach? There are two clues, I think, here that the examiner is looking for us to work at the margin. Okay, the first one is they asked you for the total additional taxes payable, not please calculate the tax liabilities, comparing if the company gifts the computer versus not gifting the computer. So they've asked you for additional taxes. By working out additional taxes payable, you're needing to make a comparison, yes, but can you get to the answer in a more time-efficient manner? And the other really big clue is the number of marks available. Always be paying attention to that. For only 4 marks, it seems pretty unlikely you'd have time to do a full corporation tax or capital allowances computation, let alone 2 of them. So part of your reading and planning time should be looking for clues like this that are going to help you figure out how to approach your answer. This is going to save you time in the long run. Okay, I wanted to show you the suggested answers just for that first requirement. I don't expect you to be reading all of this detail, but what I want you to see is how did they work at the margin? What does that actually mean in this context? But there are some other useful things to point out here that are a step up from TX. The verbs used in the requirement were to explain with supporting calculations, so you can observe from a quick scan of this answer, the calculations here, not the main event. The explanations are. You can see they've worked their way down a number of potential tax impacts of the provision of this laptop. They've thought about capital allowances, chargeable gains, corporation tax, NIC. They didn't consider income tax because the question asked specifically for the taxes the company would be looking at, not the individual. And then they've worked at the margin because they took the information about the laptop from the exhibit and how much it was valued at, which was £1,500. You didn't see that, but that's the information they were given. They just looked at that and they said, well, how much extra tax would be due? They consider Class 1A NIC because it's a taxable benefit. So, okay, that's 13.8% of £1,500. So an extra 207. What about corporation tax? Well, in this case, it's a gift of a laptop. Company already owns it. So the expense of the laptop itself isn't deductible because they would have previously got capital allowances on it. But by the fact that they're having to pay out Class 1A NIC, this actually saves them corporation tax because the employer NIC is allowed as a deduction from trading profits. So although the company has to pay out £207 Class 1A NIC, it'll save corporation tax of 25% on that, so £52. And then the net impact is only £155. So this is them working at the margin. They've not done full computations. Can you see that? Okay, let's take, what can we take away? What can we learn from all of this? We need to plan. You must spend time planning for this exam. You have to look for clues. They are there, I promise you. Answer specifically what has been asked in the way it's been asked. Pay attention to those verbs. Think about whether more than one tax applies and work as efficiently as you can. The final thing I want to show you before we move on to Q&A, so please keep some questions coming into the Q&A box, and I'll pick those up shortly. The last thing I just wanted to show you is how you can make use of your knowledge that you've already got from previous tax studies to help you in this exam. As you saw in that last example, much of what they were talking about there actually was from the TX syllabus. Class 1A NIC, capital allowances, chattels, corporation tax calculations, and so on. Also, you will be able to use exam technique approaches like reading the requirement first before the main bulk of information. Use clear headings to set out your answers. Show your workings clearly for the marker to be able to follow, and so on. And all of that is similar to what you would have done previously. Much of what you cover at ATX is built on top of the foundations of TX. If you keep building on sugary foundations, the whole house is going to come down at some point. Now, if you're a resitter of the ATX exam, one of the reasons you may have struggled in the past is because of less than secure foundational tax knowledge. So please make use of approved learning providers, the ACC Study Hub, the ACC YouTube channel to help you improve your understanding of core concepts. We're going to look at one last example just to show you how important it is to have the foundations of your tax knowledge sorted. Hopefully gives you some confidence that you already know a lot of what's going to help you at ATX. You just have to apply it differently. So this is definitely an ATX level question because you're being asked to work out the after-tax amount of money this client is going to end up with. Very typical angle to see at ATX. You're being asked to explain how the value of the estate can be reduced Again, very ATX, as we need to spot what relief to begin with and then explain the impact. Now, here's the answer. It's a bit small. Please don't worry about it. I'm going to highlight a few things for you. You don't need to actually work your way through the answer here. This marking guide actually had 7 potential marks, capped at 6. So how many of the 7 possible ways to get marks do you think were from TX or university tax knowledge? Pop a number in the chat box. There are 7 possible marks here. How many of them do you think you could do if you'd only studied TX or tax at university without anything new that you've learned at ATX? Pop a number into the chat box. I'm going to show you how many marks there are. Okay, let's start at the bottom. This bit at the bottom is all ATX. It's business property relief. It's a new tax relief you learn about ATX. So there were 2.5 marks there. You wouldn't be expected to know. Okay, so forget that. What about the computations? The calculation of the inheritance tax in the death estate, all TX knowledge, apart from where the BPR is deducted. So you could have picked up 3 marks there without knowing anything from ATX. 3 out of 7 marks, not too bad. But if you haven't covered those basics of an inheritance tax death estate again, or you've forgotten how to work it out, maybe the nil rate band, you've forgotten about how to work that out, you'd be missing out on what the examiner sees as easy marks here. On the right-hand side there, we've got workings for how to get the actual amount after tax that the client ends up with. That's definitely an ATX style of question, but you could actually get 1.5 marks there because the actual knowledge is all TX knowledge. The way it's applied is different. So do you see there's actually 4.5 marks there? 4.5 marks you could have possibly got there using prior knowledge out of 6. Do you see how important it is to have those foundations? The style of exam questions, super different, but those foundations have to be in place. Okay, then, before we get to answering questions, let's just summarise a few wee takeaways from this session. So, mostly same taxes, extra rules and reliefs. You've got to have these fundamentals in place, but we're going to apply them differently now. There's a much more international context in place, lots of overseas parts of the syllabus now. You've got to use your own judgment more. You've got to change your mindset, super important. You've got to move away from thinking about calculations to think about applying. And we need to have a much better big picture overview. So please reset your assumptions and expectations of this exam. You have to be practicing questions from early on in your studies. That's going to really help you. And please make sure you're using all of the available support that's out there. Okay, so let's jump into the question box for the last few minutes, and I'll get through as many of these as I can. Okay, we've got a question about basis period calculation. Is it excluded from the course? I'm going to assume that you're meaning the horrible basis period of assessment rules we used to have. If you're coming to this exam this year and you've done previous tax studies in a Finance Act before the one we're in just now, Finance Act 23, then those horrible overlap profits, opening year rules, yes, they have gone. They're not in the exam this year. They're gone in real life. There's a bit of a transitional period happening just now. So for your exam, you won't be examined on any of those horrible rules. So I hope that's a big relief because students used to hate them. Okay, so last ACCA paper, it's a reset for you. You've got a month left of the exam. Okay, what to do? Great question. There'll be lots of people in this same situation. You need to spend some time being really honest and reflect on why you failed previously. If you don't know, you need to reach out to somebody to ask for help and advice, whether that's getting some marking done, even just speaking to somebody about it. Think about your time management in the exam. What was the problem? And I'm always a big advocate of if something didn't work for you before, don't do the same thing again. You need to do something different. So did you do a mock before? If not, you need to do one. If you haven't been using approved learning providers, you need to do that. Or there's the ACC Study Hub as well. Brilliant free resource. Please make sure you're using these things. you need to focus on the TX knowledge that I spoke about in this session today. That has to be really solid, but you have to be doing question practice. There is no point hiding away, scared from the exam. You need to be honest and face up to what you think went wrong last time and make changes. If there's any bits of the syllabus that you shy away from because you think they're horrible, you need to address them. Those could be the 5 marks you need to push you across that finish line. Is there a wrong choice when it comes to choosing the word processor or spreadsheet answer space? Brilliant question. I personally don't think there is. However, I would caution students from only using one. It tends not to be appropriate for every answer, to just use the word processing answer space or just use the spreadsheet answer space. And I think it's actually for your own benefit to think about what's the best way. There's a table function within the word processing answer space where you can actually create little tables. That's a really nice way. If you think, I don't think I need to use massive amounts of spreadsheet here, there's a little table function you can use and keep things nice and neat. I think what doesn't look good is where people only use the word processing answer space and then they've got calculations and it can be quite messy and not look very well planned out and thought out. And also it's quite difficult. But again, don't worry about your marker. Your marker is a professional who's going to do everything they can to give you credit. But you have to think about your time in the exam. How long is it taking you pressing the space bar, however many times you have to press it to get that number to shift over? If you think you've made a mistake, going back and checking it again is a nightmare where you've got it all listed on the word processing answer space. If it's in the spreadsheet, it's super easy to change things or to spot where you've maybe gone wrong with a calculation or a working. So I think the bulk of it's probably in word processing. There's some requirements. If it only asks you to calculate, just use the spreadsheet answer space. There's no explanations needed. So you can just do all of it in the spreadsheet answer space. Please, whatever you do, make sure that you cross-reference between the two so your marker knows where you've actually put bits of the answer. Okay, I'm trying to get through as many of these as I physically can before Hazel cuts me off. Yeah, okay. Core tip to pass ATX, real challenge, balancing time constraints versus lengthy exam. Yeah, you are going to be under time pressure. You must stick to time. If you have to stop halfway through a calculation because your time's up, please stop and move on. There is very little to be gained from carrying on when the time that you've allocated for a requirement is over. And please don't just allocate time per question. I saw people were helpfully talking about how long to spend on each question in the exam. Please also allocate time per requirement, okay? There is no point you spending 20 minutes on a 5-mark requirement in the exam and then having not enough time for something else, okay? So you need to manage your time. It's really, really important. So I'm just looking to see if I can pick up another couple. Professional marks, please don't spend a huge amount of time worrying about them. The best way to get them in the exam is to read the requirements carefully and do exactly what has been asked in the way it has been asked. If you have really good exam technique in answering from a technical point of view, you don't have to be getting it perfect. You can make mistakes and still pick up the professional marks, but you have to be answering in the way they have asked you to do it. And also with ATX, it's sometimes about spotting reliefs. There'll be professional marks in there for spotting certain reliefs apply. You are never going to know what those professional marks are for in the exam when you're sitting in that exam, so you're best not to worry about it. You need to do the requirements as you have been asked to do them, and you will pick up professional marks along the way. Topics to focus on. Everything's examinable. Everything from the TX syllabus pretty much is examinable. Everything from ATX is examinable. You cannot question spot. You will see overseas aspects, but it could be across a number of taxes. You will see losses. Somewhere in there, I'd be shocked if there wasn't any. You need to be really confident with unincorporated businesses and companies as well. And you need to be confident as well in how taxes interact with each other as well. So I think we're probably out of time. I'm so sorry. I know there were some other really fantastic questions in there. So I'm really sorry if we didn't get to your question. Thank you all so much for being on this session live today. I hope it was really helpful, and I'll pass back to Hazel for some final words.
Thank you so much. And as Eileen said, we do have to bring things to a close, and I hope you found today's session really useful. It's great to see all the questions that came in. Just before we go, I'd like to remind you about the important resources that are in the resources section of the webinar. So there's links to the slides and PDF from today's session. You can also register, if you haven't already, for the ATX in Focus webinar, Examiner's Report Unlocked, which is on the 14th of February. You'll find the latest examiner reports. There's also the ATX self-check quizzes and knowledge recap modules, which you might find useful, and also the ACC Study Hub and Student Resources YouTube channel. As I mentioned to the beginning, anyone who's registered for this webinar will get an email tomorrow with the details on how you can go through it again. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today, and Aileen for extending your support, and also all of the team in the back that have supported to deliver.